realize that, and I don't have a projector, and I'm not going to give any prepared talk, even though I have like dozens of prepared talks about space. I think we should just have a discussion and go around the table and say a few words about what interests you about this topic, what excites you, or what repels you, just anything about where your head is at on the topic of space, which is a big topic. It can mean far out stuff, it can mean stuff that happened 50 years ago, it can mean a lot of different things. And I guess you're first, especially since you said you might have to go.
Sure.
You're not getting off easy.
Wait, I really have to go because this is not the right place, but I will say I'm excited about space. I hope it goes well.
Okay.
But I'm in the wrong space.
Okay.
So.
All right. I'm excited to see a new generation of space companies taking it from dead and boring and expensive to stuff that's actually happening. And even though everyone publishes blog posts entitled things like "The world doesn't understand Starship," I still think even space CEOs don't understand Starship, including the Astra guy last night. So that's my thing. When you think about constellations, small rockets have no future. So I guess that's my contentious point. All these small launch companies are dead. They just don't realize. And I'd love to discuss that.
Well, that's an interesting topic, and I can take the opposing. I'm not saying I necessarily disagree with that position, but I can certainly argue the opposing side. Yeah. Okay. A lot louder, please.
Even space CEOs don't understand Starship. They don't understand what it's It's hard for anybody who's been doing space for 50 years to understand how disruptive
Okay, this is great. Maybe this is a topic we'll come back around to as we go to the table display, because we had already 2 out of 2 on this. John?
So I'm not a space specialist. I'm in computer vision and AI infrastructure. And my point of view is that I can tell 3 to 5 years from now, AI infrastructure is going to be a hell of a lot easier, and specialists are going to be able to automate analysis, very large scales of unstructured data. And yeah, I'm eager to see the kind of application layer that fits on top of this accelerated AI infrastructure. And I think sources from space of data about the Earth are going to become more relevant, and more can be built on top of that thanks to automated systems.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. I think the Starship question is a big one, but I just want to say that Jan and I have had some deep discussions about this in the very recent past, and because we stay at the same house in San Francisco, and am I correct that you stay there? Yeah, you sleep in the same room as I do. Anyway, and I think he's absolutely right, and the stuff he demoed to me and I demoed to him sort of mutually reinforced this position that it's getting easier, and that the one thing I'll say is that, like one of the space companies that I'm heavily involved with, Planet Labs, we pull down many terabytes a day of images from space, and in most cases it's just too much for humans to deal with. I mean, they might be able to deal with it on a very local level, like looking at, my farm every day, but that's kind of where it stops. When you start looking at bigger areas, it's just too much for humans to process. So the only thing that's going to really be able to mine that data set in the large is machine vision and similar things. So that's one thing about that. The other thing, which we also discussed, which is becoming true, is that some of the hardware to do a lot of these machine vision processes, even the sophisticated ones, is getting cheap and small and light. And at least the small and light part is really important for space, and cheap never hurts. And so the idea of machine vision on satellites, so that they don't have to necessarily download terabytes of data every day, but can instead extract the interesting stuff. What do they call that at the edge? Or is there another word for it?
Yeah, AI at the edge.
Yeah, that may be important. We're going to be doing some experiments at Planet Labs on that very topic in our next generation of spacecraft. That's all I wanted to say about that.
I'm here because I really enjoy being wrong, and you proved me wrong.
I did?
Yep. early on in the
There
sort
was
of
that time you
SpaceX,
thought you were wrong.
the SpaceX, you were really, as being somebody at NASA at the time, being excited about private launch companies. You thought that was a really great step forward, and I thought that was a terrible idea. I was wrong, and so that's always an intriguing characteristic, and I always look to okay, what else does he have to say that I could be wrong about now?
Oh boy, I've got a long list, so we have to go on a long walk. I appreciate that, Brewster. I would like to learn from you to appreciate being wrong. I still have a little too much ego to really like it. I mean, I like changing my mind. It's a subtle difference. Adam and Michael, I just want to say that what we're doing is we're just briefly going around and just saying something that we are excited about or repelled about or interested about in the rough category of space, which can span all the way from before the dawn of the space age to, interstellar civilizations. It can be anything, okay? So think about that and we'll come back to you, okay? So now, let's see. We have some new arrivals, but let's go to the next in the circle. What's your name?
Phil.
Okay.
My day job, I work in venture capital and climate tech, so fun things like everything from fusion to fake meat. But my training is as a physicist, so I actually did my research for my PhD building an antimatter machine at CERN.
An antimatter machine, what?
Antimatter machine at CERN, which is the big part.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm interested both in the near term of space, in terms of what can we do for atmospheric emissions monitoring, climate modeling in the near term once we get many more satellites up there. Also things like asteroid mining. But in the far future, I'm just nerding out. You can see I did my research in antimatter. What's the long-term future of space? How do we ever conquer the speed of light and get to other places? So both near term and far term.
Well, let me mention one thing about the atmosphere modeling, because it's something that I'm directly, I'm fairly close to right now. Planet Labs and JPL are collaborating on a new mission. It's called, the internal name was Fidelity. Now it's called Carbon Mapper. And it's going to be the most exquisite imaging spectrometer ever flown in space. And JPL is building the first payload, and we're building the satellite that hosts the payload. But then they're transferring the tech to us, and we're going to build all the following versions of that payload. And we have funding now to, I think, do 6 of these. And so this is going to allow, among many other things, the creation of a public data set, free, that is methane emitters on it's going to be able to image about 1,000 targets a day, this constellation, and be able to pinpoint gross polluters of methane.
Down to what size?
The ground sampling distance is 30 meters per pixel, but to recognize a plume, it's going to take more than 1 pixel, but it's going to have the radiometric resolution and the spectral resolution to do that. But it's also going to, that only takes 2 spectral bands out of the 400 that it's going to support. So it's going to be able to measure all kinds of things having to do with the biosphere and agriculture and species diversity and other gases and mineralogical things, and it's going to be pretty cool. All those data sets are going to be data sets that we can try and sell as a company or partner with scientists on, but the methane and the CO2 data sets are going to be publicly available for free.
So just a question, how many satellites would you need for ubiquitous coverage?
You mean the whole Earth every day at this resolution?
Interpret that literally, but if you want to use it for international emissions monitoring.
No, but that's what this is for, but there actually aren't that many potential gross polluter sites. We kind of know mostly what they are. They are, they are coal, they are natural gas things that are leaking, they are landfills, and I forget exactly this. there's a couple of these kinds of sites, and okay, this satellite was not going to track trace amounts of methane drifting between the continents. It's just going to find point sources. There are other satellites with much huger pixels but much higher sensitivity that can track, that can have a swath that's thousands of kilometers wide, whereas ours is only going to be like 30 kilometers wide.
So we've been trying to answer a question, which is just if you wanted to see if countries are meeting their emissions pledges, how many satellites would you use?
That is more the domain of a satellite that's going up called GHG-SAT and greenhouse gas SAT and yeah, that's, I don't know the answer to that.
Who's making that?
You have to look it up. It's a consortium. It's not a private company per se. Who's actually building it, I don't know. Anyway, Chip.
So I'm not a space person at the moment. I've been in the past. But I'm just hugely interested in this. I think, this is where most of the future of human civilization will take place. So to a first approximation, I think the single most important metric in terms of our hopes for the long-term future is dollars per kilogram to low Earth orbit. And whenever that number gets lower, I get happier.
Okay.
It's interesting in seeing that happen.
So that's kind of back into the sort of Starship discussion. Can we backtrack to you? We skipped over you. Yeah.
Oh, I got nothing for you.
You got nothing?
I'm just listening.
All right. If you come up with something.
Oh, interested in space. Yeah, I was very interested, especially last night after rocket company tour, the idea of smart Earth and having lots of satellites in the sky that can then focus energy from the sun to a piece of the ocean to create rainfall in a place of drought. And it kind of freaks me out, and I don't know how I feel about it. But
I think that reaction might be wise.
yeah, it definitely freaks me out. I think you can back applications.
Okay, let's see. And
I came late, so I'm not even sure what the question is.
the question is, do you have thoughts about space, past, present, future, attraction, curiosity, repulsion, warnings, anything? It's just an open discussion about what? It's the final frontier.
Well, the next one. Who knows what's after that?
Yeah, right. Okay.
My name's Aaron, I don't have a name tag, but I feel pretty young in this crowd. And that's partially, so I was born after the first hype wave of, moon landing and all that kind of stuff. And most of my life, up until this point, several years ago, we've been like space dormant. Like the US has always been like leader in space, but it hasn't really done much in the last, how many decades. And then all of a sudden, we got a lot of new activity, which is really amazing. I know that is a kind of a dumb take, but like, I just want to see people on Mars because it's not like there's an economic reason to have people on Mars. I get that. We're gonna send people on Mars and we're gonna waste money, but it's like we can do it. We're so close, and it's just like it's Mars, right? So it's just we should just go there. Somebody needs to go there, and now's the time. And I like the fact that people just want to get to Mars and to just start building stuff there.
Let me ask you a question. If it was the same as with the moon landings, where we went to Mars, walked around for a bit,
Flags and footprints.
came home, and then in 50 years' time, no one had ever gone back to Mars, would you still be satisfied with that, or you'd only be satisfied as the
I think that in terms of a milestone of human exploration, okay, in terms of not going back, the amount of effort that's getting put into it right now is monumental, and there's going to be a good reason why. If we don't go back, if we don't stay on Mars or the moon, we're going to know why. Like, it's going to be very obvious. Like,
It might just be that we went a really dumb way.
The perfect model would be lots of effort, even more effort than is currently expended to go to Mars by an order of magnitude or more. And yet we never went back.
Well, we didn't go back because we went for the wrong reason.
yeah, so there's going to be, like, the way that it's happening now now, it is different, but I'm not discounting the possibility that people are going to get there and realize, there's actually, it's not sustainable the way that we're going there, that maybe it's not going to pay for itself. I think that it will. I think that there's some really good ideas, like the way that it's getting done now versus what was happening back then.
Okay.
Sorry.
In the interest of getting everybody's input, I want to. No apologies necessary. My apologies for interrupting. I do want to mention one thing in response to that, which is there's a guy whose name is Robert Zubrin. He wrote a book, The Case for Mars, quite many years ago. He's written more about Mars since then. And not only are these books awesome, but just as an aside, it was that book and a meeting with Robert Zubrin that pivoted Elon Musk from sending a greenhouse with a germinating seed in it on a Russian rocket that he was going to buy to Mars to building his own rockets to do what became SpaceX. It was Robert who convinced him that this was a worthy life goal.
Well, the Russians helped convince him.
Yeah, true enough. I mean, okay, let's see. And now?
Sure. I'm also joining late, but I think the thing that's most exciting about space for me is more the cultural elements rather than technological. A few funds ago, I did invest in Planet, which is a fantastic company, and I think as interesting culturally as it is technologically in terms of kind of ushering the wave of privatization for space as much as a company like SpaceX as a response, I think, to governments not doing enough. I think that's super exciting. I am concerned, I think, about elements of space as a form of escapism, where I think goals like terraforming Mars will start with terraforming Earth, and we shouldn't shy away from things like that. And the other thing that I'm concerned about culturally that's related to space is, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, we announced our missions to the moon. Nowadays, I feel like our response to China's advances in space and elsewhere is just met with sanctions and regulations, which is a very dangerous trend. So reasons for optimism and cautiousness.
I'd love to dialogue on every one of those points, but I guess that would take too long. But that's really good. I do want to recommend one other thing. If you contact me electronically, I'd be happy to send this to you. There's an essay called "Why Humans Explore Space," and it addresses what I think are the true reasons. It's a short essay, public domain. I'm happy to send it to you. It's by a friend of mine, who some of you may know, Larry Lemke. Anyway, and he did the most clearest thinking about this, and he's not only an aerospace engineer, he has degrees in cultural anthropology. So he really understood this thing from a perspective that no one else ever has, and I think it's a brilliant analysis, but I won't, no spoilers. And you?
Hi, my name is Manuel Maqueda and I work on weather security. The idea of not only adapting to extreme weather, but to actually prevent it from happening. Something we call a moonshot today. So my interest in space, in addition to the geek out factor, I love it, is a vantage point on Earth. And Earth is in trouble. And there's a lot of unraveling living systems on Earth. And so that's my interest of space, that it can help us save life on Earth.
I'd like to just mention one thing in support of Manuel, which is that he and I have talked about this kind of thing in the past. And although he's working on a very science tech kind of heavy project right now, we share this obsession with regenerative agriculture, which I believe is a bridge between the natural world and the world of space and the world of humans, and a thing that we really have to get behind, because if we don't, all this noise about climate and all this, we're not going to solve these problems unless we change our food system. And it's not going to involve fake meat, by the way. Okay? I mean, that's the antithesis of how you fix it. But that's a topic for another session. So let us continue. I don't know, Jake, did we do you yet, Chase?
No, I joined a little bit late.
Okay.
My name is Chase. I just have a personal interest, no deep expertise in any specific area. My avenue is more longevity, but I wanted to join and hear what you all had to say because it's fascinating.
Well, certainly at the present with the present situation of technology and science, we're going to need a lot of longevity if we're going to go on some of these exotic locations in space.
Yeah.
All right. Well played. Michael, did we talk with you yet?
Nope.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm an astronomy graduate student at Caltech. I study exoplanet atmospheres. So I use
exoplanets, atmospheres?
Yeah.
Okay.
So planets around other stars. So to do this, I use a lot of space telescopes. So I use Hubble Space Telescope. I use XMM Newton. I'm going to use JWST when it launches because these are wavelength ranges that are simply not accessible from the Earth.
Have you ever used Sophia?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. So Sophia is actually going to retire because it's not cost worthy. It's not cost effective.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's my immediate interest in space. But in the long term, I want us to create a mostly self-sustaining human colony on another world.
Does the moon count as another world?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Why not? Yeah, because the Earth has finite resources, finite space. A nuclear war could kill us all. We need a backup. And also we need a source of infinite resources, which is basically what space is.
All right.
So that's the future, and I hope it happens.
Doc Brown.
Do you think post-nuclear war Earth is less hospitable than the moon is today?
If I die in it, then yes.
Well, you just mentioned the JWST, so maybe that's an exciting thing that's happening in space.
Hopefully not too exciting.
So JWST, James Webb Space Telescope, funded $500 million, launch date 2007. It's now at $10.5 billion, which is a multiplication by 21, and it's due to launch later this month, but we'll see. And it's, in astronomy they call it the satellite that ate NASA. We basically stopped launching anything, space telescopes, because every single one that was meant to be launched, its budget was eaten by the JWST that became too big to fail. Except the concern is that it might fail, because it's going to go out, it's going to reach a Lagrange point much further from the Earth than we have ever visited.
Well, than a human has ever visited, and there it's going to unfurl. And it's in some origami style thing because it's too big. The mirror is too big to fit into the unfolded into the spacecraft. And if there's something wrong, it's going to be awkward because we don't have any of space satellites because we cancelled them all to fund JWST's ever-ballooning budget. And the only other time we've ever launched a satellite of this scale that was actually somewhat smaller was Hubble. And when we launched it, we discovered that it needed a little human engineering wrenching to get it actually to work. And, well, it would be honestly quite exciting if we had to send humans out to L2. Because it would actually give us something to do in space. Okay, that's a silver lining to that dark cloud.
So, from one point of view, maybe it would be the fire that would actually give us some reason to go to space, it's not just flag pointing. But from another point of view, it would be very embarrassing if we spent 15 years worth of NASA Space Telescope budget on something that didn't work.
Yeah, there are a few other space telescopes that are launching, but they're very, very small compared certainly to JWST. Everything is. Another interesting thing about Hubble, of course, is that it was not only repaired after its initial problems by humans, it was then upgraded 3 times with human missions that installed new instruments and gave it whole new capabilities, and it's still doing science, although it's starting to show some signs of age with system failures, but it's still alive. Ulrich.
I don't really have anything particularly specific. My background is in software, but I have expanded from there to more general engineering, and I really like solving difficult problems and learning about them, and space has a lot of those, so that's why I'm sitting here and not somewhere else.
Yeah, a lot of space engineering is quite difficult. Some parts are not as difficult as people said, and Planet Labs sort of proved that by launching these kind of cheap, janky satellites and actually making a useful product out of them. But especially these mechanisms that Adam was referring to, it turns out getting mechanical things to work in space is fraught with trouble, and there's a very interesting consequence to that which I want to point out, which is the space industry, how can I say it's a lot of things that humans do, and I think particularly in science and engineering, we don't keep good, careful track of the lessons that we learn from our mistakes, especially across more than like one career length. Obviously an individual can keep track of this stuff, but space mechanisms is a very interesting niche field in aerospace engineering. How to get gears and motors and pulleys and hinges and springs and explosives and all the different things that we use on board spacecraft to work in environments where they might travel for many, many years in high vacuum with crazy temperatures. And anyway, to get them to work, it's been amazing how many missions have failed over the decades because the mechanisms, the simple mechanical linkages failed. And there it has caused that community, the space mechanisms community, to embark on a project which is now probably in its 30th plus year of cataloging all the failures and all the and diagramming the failures and understanding them and all the lessons learned and making all these handbooks so that new entrants into this field can go back and not reinvent the wheel and not just make the same mistakes over and over again, but make new mistakes. So, although the JWST has got a lot of mechanisms and a lot of aggressive, optimistic technology, particularly mechanical and optical, that community is, I think, the best on Earth that I know of, at least in engineering. I don't know much about nuclear engineering, but they're like some of the best at an engineering culture that maintains and increases its expertise without backsliding very much.
Do you think they failed to learn the meta lesson of the past, though, which is don't have a project that's too big to fail?
No, that's a different problem. That's not a space mechanisms problem. That's a
policy issue.
Yeah, that's a policy problem, and that's a politics problem. Yeah.
So that's interesting that we failed so slowly that people die or their careers end before we can learn from those failures.
Well, no, I'm not saying that they're all like that, but there's been rapid iteration in the past and certainly in the present in spaceflight. But the thing is that still there can be rapid iteration and the knowledge can get lost, and that's a thing that's very important to not do. Anyway,
that's what we have Slack for, right?
Oh, yeah, right.
This is my opportunity to say how much I hate Slack.
No, that's what we have the Internet Archive for.
Yes, thank you.
How long has the Internet Archive been crawling the web?
25 years.
Well, we should put the space mechanisms books online, except there's a bunch of ITAR restricted stuff in them. Anyway, the other topic.
Launch Space regularly teaches courses.
What? Could you talk louder?
Launch Space regularly teaches courses in space mechanisms.
Yeah.
Marshall Kaplan's.
Yeah. No, they really. I think a great many engineering disciplines could learn from the space mechanisms discipline just by studying these materials. There's a few thousand pages of these materials, and it's very interesting because the whole community has collaborated on these annually growing, not just conferences and collected papers, which lots of disciplines do, but it's sort of these handbooks that get updated as more information comes through. So this is a sort of, oh, he's gone. This is like a cultural, was it you? It was you. This is an interesting cultural aspect to the space program. I mean, there are many. Okay, let's see. Our Starship people kind of left.
I'm still.
You're still.
So I think it's interesting to see how much more difficult it is to iterate when you don't really have your lab and your kind of training data in space. So I think having like a moon base where we can test these new technologies with different gravity environments could be very interesting. And I'm somewhat more hopeful about immediate things that are happening on Earth. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on using Earth-based telescopes in conjunction to act as a kind of bigger telescope.
And that's already done. And there's two different ways of doing it. The simple way, which is kind of the baby way, is exemplified by networks of telescopes. The one I'm most familiar with, and one of the biggest, is called the Los Cumbres Observatory, but it's a distributed network of telescopes worldwide, roughly half-meter and meter-class telescopes, which are like moderate university-scale telescopes. It's mostly funded by an early Google guy, but it's. I think there's hundreds of telescopes in this network now all over the world. And what this allows is a couple of very interesting things. One thing it allows is if you know something's going to happen, like a transit of an exoplanet or something at a certain time, you can be sure, weather permitting, that there will be a telescope. These are all remotely operated telescopes that you can observe with. Another thing is that if something crazy happens, like a supernova or something, telescopes can stay on it 24/7, again weather permitting, because as each one rotates out of the night, if the thing is visible in the night sky, there will always be a telescope where it's night and you can point to it. Anyway.
I use that telescope, by the way.
Oh, you do Los Cumbres? What did you use it for?
I use it for exoplanet transits.
Oh, okay, there we go. Then there's another version of telescopes coupled together on Earth, and that is a much more sophisticated version, which is there's a number of them. There's one in California. There's the big one is I think in Chile, European Southern Observatory. You use that one too. The one where they couple together those 4 big telescopes interferometrically, and then you get the effect of the resolution increase. See, there's a thing that a lot of people don't know. This is a detail, but it's worth pointing out. The reason that humans build larger and larger telescopes on the ground and in space is not, as they will try and tell you, to gather more light, because actually using long duration exposures and exposing for multiple nights, you can kind of gather as much light as you want with modern electronic sensors that count photons and stuff like that. The reason they build larger and larger telescopes is because if you build them perfectly, the larger the telescope, the higher the resolution of the instrument. And so that's really a reason that we build these large telescopes. And when you couple smaller telescopes together in an optically perfect manner, not taking separate photos with each telescope, but bringing all the light rays together in phase and interfering them together, you get some of the resolution advantages of a larger aperture. Okay. On the question of iteration, I have something else I want to say about that, which is a lesson we learned at Planet. So when we started, it was a bunch of, there were a lot of like Silicon Valley people, right? And it was started as a satellite company. We're now a data company. We spend money building satellites, but we don't make money building satellites. We make money selling data. So that was the thing that took a while to realize was the correct business model. But we said we were going to build these satellites and iterate them rapidly and build hardware like software and have multiple releases and keep launching rapidly. And that is not completely false, but what it turned out, at least in the environment that exists currently, it might start to change soon. It takes a long time to get ready for a launch on a rocket, and rocket launches get delayed, and there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through when you want to put something on a rocket, especially if the rocket is carrying stuff for other people and they want to make sure your thing doesn't explode and destroy their thing or start bolts come off and start rattling around. So there's still a lot of testing, and it's still expensive, so you really don't want to launch much that's going to fail. So what turned out is that we iterated our hardware quite rapidly in the lab, but then when it comes time to actually check it out and see if it really works in orbit, that is usually like a 6-month lead time, basically from or several months at least, from when the thing is done to the thing is launched, assuming it makes it. And that really can slow down your cycle, your OODA loop or your iteration cycle, because unlike software where you can fix the bug, and run your tests in a matter of hours, you just can't do that. You can't fix your bug, launch something into space in a matter of hours and get a new test.
In space?
Oh, well, if there's no other way, it's like, and if we could, right? Here's another thing that I think people have to realize. It goes back to what we were talking about yesterday, what I was talking about yesterday. There's precious little that we do in space, if you think about it. we do Earth observation, we do communication satellites, we do some military stuff, which is mostly Earth observation and communications of a different sort, and we do scientific research that can only be done from space, like looking in the infrared windows that are blocked by the atmosphere, so that you couldn't do it on the ground telescope. That's a JWST thing, for instance. But it's like, even with Starship, it is so much more expensive to do anything in space that it's like gotta be, if it's 1,000 times, like these days it's 1,000 times more expensive to do something in space than it is on the Earth, kind of almost choose your thing, all right? So it's like, it has to be 1,000 times better in some way to do it from space. So maybe observing the Earth, you can't do it another way from that vantage. Maybe relaying communications, well, maybe you can, maybe you can't. Fiber optics versus satellites, you know, it's a competition. So this is the thing. Now, if Starship and things, or maybe more exotic launchers like the Space Gun, you know, if they can bring the cost of launch down 1 or more orders of magnitude, at some point, new markets will be enabled, like things that don't make economic sense if it's 1,000 times more costly to do them in space, but maybe they do make economic sense if it's 50 times more costly to do them in space.
That's what Chip was saying.
Yeah.
Technologies, I'm not a specialist, but I've heard of like the space elevator.
No, that's a different thing.
Well, it reduces the cost to put things in space.
Yeah, and it's also impossible. You know, an anti-gravity machine will also reduce the cost of getting things in space. You know?
Teleportation, right?
Yeah, right. But I mean, the basic point there is that if you have technology or industrial capacity that brings the cost of something way down, new markets can be open. Now, one of the reasons that we're doing the same things in space that we were doing 50 plus years ago, you know, communications, observation, and science, is because we're using basically the same technology, which has the same real costs. We're using liquid fuel rockets with liquid oxygen usually, and you know, various fuels and oxidizers, but quite often cryogenic. Expendable. Well, the shuttle was not expendable. Yeah, but I mean,
barely reused.
Well, we used many times. It was just a lot harder than we thought, and it wasn't nearly as cheap as we thought. I mean, look, this is a stand. Look at that JWST. I mean, these projects, for some reason, the big ones at least, are plagued with overruns. Even Elon Musk was like, you know, there's jokes about what is it? There's years which normally people work in, and then there's space years, which are like 5 actual years. Because people say like, we're going to launch this in 2 years, and it takes 10. And then there's, you know, SpaceX years, which are kind of in the middle. Like there, they say they'll do it in a year, and it takes 3 or 4, but maybe not 10. Various reasons for that would be interesting culturally to examine and see what lessons we can learn from that. But we're using the same technology to get into space that Robert Goddard invented, or that Tsiolkovsky invented, the liquid fuel rocket, but Tsiolkovsky invented it on paper, and then Goddard actually got it to fly, and then Wernher von Braun got it to really be useful, if you consider bombing London useful, and then you know, went on to mastermind the Apollo program and its predecessor programs. But quite frankly, Starship is also essentially the same technology. It's liquid fuel rockets, and primarily, or one of the primary reasons that Starship may be able to realize some of these dramatic cost reductions is a really simple reason that has been known by the rocket community for a long, long time, which is bigger rockets are more efficient in terms of cost per kilogram to orbit. And that's because of these things called scaling laws. But basically, smaller rockets cost more per kilogram to get into orbit. Now, smaller rockets can be much cheaper than big rockets, but then again, they take much, much less payload into orbit. So, in spite of what Malcolm said, that he thinks that nano launchers are all going to go away because of Starship, there's probably, I think, some niche markets for nano launchers. Like if you want to replace one satellite in a constellation that's gone out, you know, one thing is you can't go wherever you want. When a satellite is launched on a rocket and it goes to a particular orbit, and you really can't change its orbit very much at all. You specifically can't change its inclination or its altitude very much.
Well, there's the thing like the Apple II.
What?
The Apple II was not a cost-effective computer in terms of computrons per dollar.
Yeah.
But you could buy one.
Yes, and that's the thing about Nano Launch. You can buy one. You know, a startup. Now,
is Astra a nano launcher?
Yeah. A nano launcher is kind of like anything that's, I'd say, 500 kilograms or under. I don't know, nano launcher, micro launcher. I don't know that there's a standard terminology.
I have a question for you. We talked a bit about the kind of cultural aspect, inspiration, let's go to Mars, why do we want to go to Mars? Is that a different enough challenge that's going to push us with different constraints to make other types of technology than liquid fuel, what we're currently using?
That's a complicated story, and again, I'm sort of channeling my inner Bob Zubrin here, but I'll say this. Even since Wernher von Braun's time, people have proposed non-chemical propulsion, specifically for deep space. No one is proposing a launch, well, not until very recently have people proposed launch systems that don't use liquid fuel rockets. However, once you're at escape, once you're at orbital velocity, you have a different problem. Now you have a problem of, like, to get somewhere far away, you need really efficient thrust. You don't need much of it. To get initial orbital velocity, you need a ton of thrust to make it through the atmosphere. I mean, many tons of thrust to make it through the atmosphere and all this stuff. That's why the huge rockets with huge fiery plumes and staging and all this stuff. But once you're in space, to go somewhere different, to change orbit, to go to other targets in the solar system, requires actually really efficient propulsion. And by efficient, I mean a very small amount of propellant gives you a lot of velocity. And so everyone has known, even since before any rockets were ever launched, that nuclear was a possibility for this, or from the early days of rocketry. And when nuclear energy was discovered, everyone was like, well, nuclear energy has 1,000,000 times the energy per kilogram as chemical, you know. So obviously a nuclear-powered rocket is the way to go. So why not use a nuclear-powered rocket to go from Earth orbit to Mars orbit? Because this would be so much more efficient in terms of. Now, there's a couple problems with that. One is nuclear reactors are very heavy. So though it's true that nuclear energy has these enormous energy densities, when you take into account the whole reactor system, maybe not. But there's another problem with that, to get to Mars using this kind of exotic propulsion. And that is that that's been kind of used for a long time, at least before Elon Musk, who you'll notice is not proposing to use nuclear engines to go to Mars. That we need to wait for a functional nuclear propulsion or even functional solar electric propulsion to go to Mars has been like an excuse for NASA to be like, well, good thing we have to spend 20 years in, developing this technology before we go to Mars. And they've been saying this for, decades. And so to some extent, like Zubrin called it a snow day. He's like, it's just like, if you remember, if you grow up in a place in the US where the schools could get closed when there's a heavy snow, it's like, and all the kids are going bananas because they get to go play in the snow instead of going to school, right? He's like, all these scientists and technologists go bananas because they don't actually have to build something to go to Mars, which we know how to do. They can get to goof around with technology because you need my technology before you go to Mars. So fun to me.
But they already, so NASA already built nuclear thermal rockets as part of Project Nerva.
That was not NASA, that was the Department of Energy.
Okay.
And those were not rockets, they were
engines.
They were engines. And they were not necessarily engines that, they were prototypes. And they were a number of nuclear rocket engine prototypes. And it was actually the US flew one nuclear engine prototype. It's flown, both the US and the Russians have flown multiple nuclear reactors in space, but they were usually to just produce electricity, and then it was used for various things, including possibly electric propulsion. But a nuclear thermal rocket, where the reactor is used directly to heat the propellant and expand it, instead of a burning and oxidizing chemical energy process. No, that's not true. We never flew a nuclear thermal rocket, but we flew one nuclear-powered propulsive satellite. It's such a typical thing. It failed. Like, it failed immediately in orbit because of some capacitor that shorted out. And they never even, I don't even know if they ever turned it on.
Isn't there funding to restart?
What?
Isn't there new funding to restart Nerva now?
There have been a number of times when nuclear, I don't know about Nerva, but there's Project Timberwind, and there was a joint Russian-American project. There have been a number of nuclear propulsion restarts, but I don't think any of them even got close to where the Nerva program got in terms of actually testing stuff.
On the software side, when do you think we'll see like the first kind of like killer product of, like, to use a specific example, Planet going from offering tremendous amounts of data to actual insights where I could log on and say how many ships are going in and out of Singapore every day, or how many acres have been deforested in like the Amazon?
I think that stuff is it's already in prototype form. We have it. Other people have it based on our data, you know, and other satellite systems are being used for it. And as for whether it will be the killer product, I don't know, but there's people who are hoping it will be the killer product, and they're developing it, and we already have stuff like that. Like, we have stuff that can find roads globally. Like, we can tell you with pretty high accuracy how many roads were built on the entire planet, you know, in the last 6 months. Now, is anybody going to pay us big bucks for that information? I don't know. But we did it, you know, and there's a million things like that.
It's also kind of a problem too, if you're the only provider of something, you could be monopolistic, but also people know that you don't have that many people to sell it to, so it's kind of an economic issue.
And it's also a problem of the adoption cycle. You know, it's like everybody doesn't need to know this, right? Only a few people. I mean, I thought you were going to say when there's going to be a killer app from space, and I would have to say that let's go around. Who can mention some killer apps that are only here because of not spin-offs in the space program, but that are only here because actually of stuff going on in space? GPS. Bingo. What? GPS.
Yeah,
like everybody uses GPS every day, all the time, you know, and that's only because of these.
Before GPS, it
what?
sucked.
What?
I remember the world before GPS. It sucked.
Fold-out maps. Yeah, right. It was the worst.
Loran C. I mean,
and those fold-out.
awful.
Oh yeah, for ships and stuff. And I could just remember I could never get those maps folded back correctly.
I still.
That's a joke for us old timers.
Yeah. I still like to look at a display that's a fold-out map.
Yeah. True.
I hate having a little thing you got to
Geostationary satellites to low Earth orbit.
That's happening.
Starlink. Do you think that'll be a killer?
Can you say that again?
I'm sorry, I was saying, what about moving internet from geostationary satellites to low Earth orbit, which is happening now? Could that be?
Yeah, I think Starlink is going to be quite profitable, but I'm not sure that it will displace the infrastructure in major urban areas, because it's just much cheaper to lay fiber once to an apartment building than it is to give everybody a Starlink terminal, and there are all thousands of them trying to use this one satellite.
But that's not the market. The market is not urban.
The market is what?
The market is not non-urban.
Yeah, right. So this is the, you know, it's a great move, and I can tell you it works like a charm. We have Starlink at a number of locations that I frequent, and it's for a while it was spotty at first when they only had a few hundred satellites up there, but it's getting really good, at least in the areas where it's turned on. Now we'll see when there's 1,000 times as many customers how it scales, behaves on the load. Yeah.
But what are you excited about? Pick your time frame. You've been in this space business for a while. What are some of the things that are coming up that is like, okay, that's cool. It could be risky, might not happen, but just.
Yeah, I'm a little bit jaded, and I'm also a little bit involved in the day-to-day, so I don't spend that much time actually thinking those thoughts, because you see, I thought we were going to be on the moon and like when I was a kid and people were walking around on the moon, I was like, well, of course we're going to have like a city on the moon by the year 2000, you know, because that was impossibly far away. And when I was in high school, it was like 1977 or something, right? And you know, I thought well, if they're walking around on the moon now, like, let's celebrate New Year's Eve on the moon 2000. It should be easy, right? And
is it true that Hilton or Conrad Hilton wanted to put a hotel on the moon?
He did.
He did.
Yeah.
Well, it was Baron Hilton, actually.
So, I don't know if I'm very excited about space tourism. I don't know if I'm very excited about asteroid mining. I mean, I'm excited, but as I mentioned yesterday, what would excite me is an intermediate stage, something that is between what we have now and a Mars colony or an asteroid mine, because that's a huge gulf, and we need something that pays the bills.
But let me lay out.
Please try and speak louder. I know it's not your normal voice.
First of all, as a plug, I have an essay in the New Atlantis, fall issue.
In the what?
The New Atlantis.
The New Atlantis.
It's a quarterly journal on technology and society.
Okay.
That describes how much the Starship is going to change everything. It means basically you throw out the satellite design in there. Just imagine as a vision. Right now there's an orbit that nobody uses. There's nothing in it. It's called equatorial Leo.
Equatorial?
Leo.
Leo, yeah, right.
Now imagine if there was a Starship leaving on schedule every day into that orbit at a cost of $20 a pound.
$20 a pound?
$20 a pound. And because chemical rockets do not have to cost that much. The reason they cost a lot is not because of the cost per propellant. Propellant's cheap. It costs about as much as milk. The cost of a rocket launch has been driven by the low flight rate. Even if you completely reuse it, Elon recognizes he has to fly a lot to make it work. But that's why he's doing it.
Okay, but can we put you back on track about equatorial Leo and what's so great about it, and what is this new use case?
It maximizes your payload to orbit because you get full advantage of Earth's rotation, and you can get there. You don't have launch windows.
You don't have what?
No launch windows.
Yeah.
You launch anytime you launch. You're in that orbit. If you want to do single orbit rendezvous, you got to wonder for that every hour and a half. And you're getting everything into one plane, so you don't have all this stuff coming at all these high relative velocities. It's easier to manage traffic there. We should be doing as much there as possible. And when you do that, when you got propellant in equatorial Leo at $20 a pound, it doesn't cost that. You can do a plane change cheaper than you can do a direct launch on a nano launcher.
Okay, that's all very interesting, and that is important because that represents infrastructure that can make profit, and it represents a thing that's an innovative thought. But so then, what would you do? Like, let's say you're able to do these launches, and you've got this propellant, and you can do these plane changes. It's like, I just wonder, what would we do in low Earth orbit that is, or even like, what would this enable? What new products, markets, activities?
Did you have a space hotel?
A rotating space hotel. A rotating gravity laboratory where we can know what happens at 6G, where we can know what happens at 4/10 of a G.
They've been one way to know a lot of that would be to put a centrifuge on the space station, so you could do fractional Gs. That's the thing that NASA
in Japan. Right?
Yeah, I know. This is the thing that NASA has started and stopped for 25 years. They can't even get a centrifuge. It's such a coordination and competition problem. Anyway, sorry. We have a person who hasn't spoken yet.
I have a question for you. You guys have all heard of the overview effect, right? You see the Earth from space, people's brains change around.
What happened to William Shatner?
Yeah.
That's an example we all have.
Yeah. And there was a great long now presentation about the overview effect. You put people in space and they see the Earth, they just think about humanity differently, right? And so space tourism is probably for rich people, but how about subsidized space travel for the purpose of like getting us all to think better about our common humanity.
Like a field trip, like you go on.
Yes, a field trip, exactly. Your fourth grade teacher.
At $20 a pound, you know, cheaper than lunch.
Right, it's educational.
Especially for kids.
Yes. With kids, it's even cheaper. I will say this about it, though.
It's gonna be a win.
I will say this though. At $20, even at $20 a pound.
Yeah.
For the overview effect, psychedelics are cheaper.
Yeah. But we don't give those to kids. We don't give those to kids. We can do this with elementary school.
I do have a question. I do have a question though. So one of the ways that Elon proposed to pay off Starship was to try to turn it into a new transit system. People. I'm not sure how much talk or how feasible it is. I wanted to get your opinions on he wants to do half an hour from anywhere on the planet to anywhere else. And there's fine. There's the transit part where it's okay, rich people can get really fast there really fast.
Right.
But then you think
you have to spend 45 minutes in airport security. And,
there's that aspect, but then there's the other aspect. Okay, because we have a space force now, right? And if you imagine the U.S. military, the Marines have this saying of they're half an hour away from any place on the planet. They can dump however many Marines that they want to go into any zone, and that creates a region of control, right?
Yeah.
So if you have an ability to drop people from space onto any point on the planet from just within a half an hour, you're some event is occurring, and then you just drop Marines from space straight down. With some
like hypersonic missiles, basically.
Kind of, but you've got ground presence, and you've just got an ability to project force anywhere at any time. It's going to change. That kind of changes the whole military aspect, which probably is worth it, I would assume.
You'd have to expend the rocket, though.
Why?
Get it back.
Starship
You're not going to get it back.
requires some fairly sophisticated facilities at the landing site.
There's no landing site. There's the Starship landing site is a very sophisticated piece of apparatus, which hasn't even really been built yet.
Right. So if you could drop people in, even on a rocket you secure the area ostensibly, and then you claim all the stuff back. Maybe I don't know, but the fact that you can get there.
True, but as you point out, the economics of Starship totally change if you can't reuse it. So that's a difference. Whereas the thing that he's talking about with any place in the world in half an hour. Well, that doesn't mean any place in the world. That means any place in the world where there's a Starship landing platform, which is going to be one place in the world for a while, and then two places, and then eventually a lot. And then the question is and this is a problem that certain other space companies have dealt with when they propose similar things, though not at the same scale, and that is, and that Concorde had this problem. What really is the market? How many people are going to pay a premium, and you can bet it's going to be a premium over air travel. How many people are going to pay a premium to get there in 1 hour?
Beyonce?
But how many Beyoncés are there?
Wait, I forgot. So the landing site is for the base. That's the complicated part, the chopsticks, right? That's the weird part. The front end.
That's for the booster.
Yeah, for the front end. It doesn't need all that. It can just land anywhere, right?
Maybe you're right.
Starship can land anywhere, but it won't be able to take off again.
No. But you could just reclaim it. You could just ship it back. I'm not talking about for transit. I'm talking about for the military. If they want to drop people in.
Can we? It's an interesting use case. Can we go forward? You've been raising your hand for a while.
Sure. Quick point and then a question. Hypersonic missiles are basically kind of what you're describing in the sense of very few logistics required. You don't need to store people. But the military benefit of it is real-time targeting, and they basically sit there in space as a sort of Damocles that a military in real time could disperse quite literally hundreds of war.
Right. Another sort of Damocles.
Yeah, they're too fast.
And that's really cool for just destroying an area. But if you want to project, you want to put people in there.
Sure.
Maybe we should send not Marines, but just school teachers. Can we get school teachers anywhere in the world in 30 minutes?
Christian missionaries.
No, but what if you stored aid for an earthquake, and then anytime that there's an incident anywhere on the planet, within a half an hour, stuff's raining down on top of you to prevent anybody from dying?
Interesting. You actually had a question, though.
I did have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So to go back to an earlier point, you said you were jaded. If you had to unpack that and also maybe say reasons why you're concerned about the future, is it geopolitical, source of jadedness, financial, talent not entering the market, technical, software?
Well, there's no end of complicated issues, institutional issues, political issues, economic issues. I just think that when you're young and you get excited about space, it seems like we're on the cusp. It seemed like we were on the cusp when as I tweeted some time ago during the middle of the pandemic, the first pandemic scare and the riots and all this, I was like, when I was a kid in 1968, let's see what, and the astronauts were about to go up on the new SpaceX thing to the space station. I was like, 1968, I was a child. What was going on in the world? Race riots, cities on fire, Hong Kong flu sweeping across the planet, killing millions of people, and astronauts going up on a new rocket into space. It's like, how things have changed.
Okay, so that's 1968. When I grew up, I was like, man, I'm never going to see a human on the moon or Mars in my lifetime.
Oh, okay.
And I still think that's probably true.
You think we will not see a human on the moon in your lifetime?
No.
That's pretty pessimistic, but maybe it's true. I mean, I will say this: it's long and difficult and expensive, and Starship is long and difficult and expensive. It's a long road. I mean.
But so just for perspective, when I was a teenager, I thought the same thing, and that was the prevalent opinion in Germany that
the space age is
not
over.
Gonna happen. Like we don't need to. It's not worth it. It's too difficult. Whatever. So I totally understand what you mean. Yeah. I mean, of course, it has completely changed now. But there was a time, and I mean, you're quite a bit younger probably. So it's interesting that there was such a long period of time where that was what people thought.
So what should we do with your realization that you were overly optimistic and we are probably overly optimistic, and how should we recalibrate?
I don't know.
Or should we just stay overly optimistic and have our dreams dashed? Right? But like at least then we'd try and cool shit.
Yeah. Or you can become like me and be overly pessimistic.
That doesn't look that fun. It's way more fun to be overly optimistic.
Okay. I have a reason to be optimistic.
Yeah.
I just got a tour of Astra that I was freaking blown away by. It was completely awesome. Chris Kemp was on fire with this whole thing, and it was just great to see a company that got best I can tell, $100 million in VC type funding. Right? We started thinking machines with $8 million, and even with inflation, $100 million is a lot more. And they did, they went public with this SPAC, whatever that bullshit is. But he got $500 million more, and it's a company now worth $2.7 billion, according to Google Finance, whatever it is. And they haven't made any money at all. And so there's this. You basically got this guy, Chris Kemp, is awesome, and 100 people getting $500 fucking million in investment to go into space, right? And have nothing to show for it financially. This is great, right? This is on the level of effort and power and ability to raise money to do weird ass gigantic
and also to execute. They made it into orbit on their most recent launch, and they made it years less than it took SpaceX from start to finish to make it, and they made it significantly less than Rocket Lab, their main competitor, or one of their main competitors. And so, it's quite a...
it's an incredible group of people. Terrific, right? But it's just a group of people, right? With an amazing amount of rocket fuel dollars behind them to be able to get something awesome done. So I think it's, in terms of dreaming big, the idea of being able to dream $100 million to $500 million big is completely within our grasp, right? Or you even take some of just Bitcoin fictitious millionaires. There's still millionaires that are doing weird ass big things, and so I think that's actually a reason for your generation to be more maybe optimistic than some of us. Maybe it's bureaucratic crap that sort of slowed things down after.
Do you want to hear like what is really optimistic about that situation?
Yeah.
You probably have a whole bunch of other rich friends, and you being excited about $500 million is going to help convince all of your rich other friends to like, oh, hey, maybe I should get into that, because the total investment that we need is probably like 500 billion, right? And that's what I want to see in the next couple of years. And you are going to be a great ambassador to go to like all your country clubs and convince other people.
You may be overestimating my bank account.
Like I said, I'm overly optimistic about your ability to persuade people.
I like the vision.
We're not waiting for the government to do it anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope the success in the private markets provides an incentive to fix cost disease in NASA. I mean, with the James Webb is the example of
NASA is making itself irrelevant. It's not, we don't need
Yeah, there's certain types of problems that you said, were worth getting out of NASA into the Elon Musk's, the Jeff Bezos, the Chris Kemp's.
I also want to state a counter view. Who actually funded SpaceX? Who actually funded Astra? A great deal of that money came from the federal government. And so when we say...
For the right reasons.
Well, and another thing I want to say, who else sent rovers to Mars, probes to Saturn, probes to Jupiter, orbiting probes to Titan, probes to Neptune, Pluto, Uranus?
I was referring to human spaceflight.
Okay, NASA does a few other things besides human spaceflight.
Well, and they do aviation too.
Yeah.
I'm talking. My point is, human spaceflight, NASA's making itself.
Even though they're the ones buying the seats, but okay.
Yes. And in terms, let's say, SLS is slipped again.
SLS is another thing. All right, you look like
yeah. So we had a conversation here where we were trying to come up with the in-between thing, in between Starlink and going to Mars, and so traditionally, when there wasn't an economic reason to do something, that is the one spot where the government comes in with government-funded research, and so for a long time it seems like, and even now, NASA is spending a lot of money on just new launch vehicles, getting to orbit, and moving around in space. All these things that seem to now be solved problems that the private sector has done a much better job with. So maybe the answer is, if there isn't anything, then we should just have lots more publicly funded research missions that give a reason for these businesses to exist and improve the infrastructure.
But what did you say? Publicly funded research missions? Is that what you said?
Yeah, and of course that's happening, but it's like just need a lot more of that.
So I want to respond to that by saying that's cool, but if you write to me and I send you this essay, Why Humans Explore Space, which is a little different than publicly funded research missions, I agree. Lemke makes the point that there's a set of reasons which are often, and this essay is pre-SpaceX, but it says there's a set of reasons that are always trotted out to justify the space program. They basically fall into scientific justification. We can do all these science things. Economic justification. It generates all this interesting technologies. Military, national security justifications. And what he goes through in a pretty devastating short article is that these are false. None of these things are true. You cannot justify these expenditures based on their scientific return. If you measure scientific return in terms of like number of peer-reviewed papers or something like that, you cannot justify them in economic terms if it's by various economic measures, and you cannot justify them on national security terms. Just a sec. And then he makes the case, which I'm not going to do the spoiler alert for, what it is that justifies them, and it's not. It's not any of these things. It's not any of these kind of venal, mundane, things. It's actually things that you can't really say in a public debate because people will think you're crazy. But it has to do with culture and it has to do with psychology.
It's just the best thing in the world.
Yeah, and so
we gotta do this.
Yeah, that's the thing. But see, that's not. But that's like, it's like for people to actually, if that's actually true, that's a totally different discussion, And
but
so
that was kind of my point. That we shouldn't. We don't necessarily need to go on a bunch more research missions because the research is so important. We just need something that. Isn't it crazy that it's a private company that's most likely going to be the first on Mars, while at the same time there's no money to be made there at this point. That's amazing. But
I'm not sure that's as likely as you think, but I have a feeling it would probably be a government mission that utilized this technology. But I could be wrong.
Then the right thing is happening because the motivation and the reason to do this comes from the government, and the way it's done, the way it's executed is by the private.
It might be rather like, I suspect but do not know, that it might be rather like what's just happened with the SpaceX Dragon Falcon combo and astronauts. Like the first few missions are government funded astronauts to say the ISS, and then after a few of those, space tourists, private citizens, whatever you want to call them, rich people who aren't government astronauts do it. That could be what happens on Mars, easily. And who knows? Maybe it'll be the other way around.
As long as you're making reading recommendations, let me go get a book called The Long Space Age.
Oh yeah, that's
by Alex McDonald.
It's written by Alex McDonald, a dear friend of mine who I worked at NASA with for many years, who knows, he's dear friends with Chris Kemp, with Will Marshall. I mean, we all worked at NASA together. And Alex McDonald, I have all editions of McDonald's The Long Space Age, which was his doctoral dissertation. I have the draft version, and he had to cut out these chapters, and then I have the actual dissertation, and then I have the book that he published, and he has enough material now for a second book. It's a brilliant book, but please go on.
So the point is that up until basically the end of World War II, all space science, pretty much all space science was funded philanthropy. It was privately funded. All the observatories that were built in the United States were private foundations. Guggenheim, Carnegie. And it was only after the war that the government got involved in this stuff. And my point is that if you got $20 a pound to Leo, you can go back to where, in fact, Yuri's doing it, right? Yuri wants to do a mission. He wants to do an interstellar mission, but he also wants to do Enceladus. You're going to see private people doing planetary science missions.
Okay, let me say something about that though. For a lot of scientific robotic space missions, it's actually not the launch costs that dominate. They're significant, but they don't dominate. So you could drop the launch costs to zero, and they're still going to be about as expensive. Well, that might be about as expensive as they already are.
The point of my new Atlantis article is when you drop launch costs, the other costs come down too.
Yeah, the reason
because you redesign, you come up to completely redesign
the reason the spacecraft costs so damn much is because it's got, you have so few launch opportunities that everybody wants to get their experiment on board, and so now you've got the systems integration problem from hell.
And it's got to be ultra lightweighted, which means there's no margins for error.
And because the launch is so expensive, it had damn well better work on the first try, and so that increases the engineering cost and development time.
That's what my article in the New Atlantis is about. It describes how it just changes everything.
Perhaps so. I mean, I'll tell you though, like certainly when we get into the sort of high-end missions like the Mars rovers, like they're way more expensive than the rockets they go up on, way more. Now, I agree.
Mass produce them and the price comes down.
Yeah, but no one's going to mass produce through something that goes to Enceladus. That's a one-off.
No, you want to fly a whole flock of stuff through those.
No, yeah, I'm certainly. What?
Elon Musk said the Starship can go to any moon or any solid body in the solar system.
I don't think it'll cover it.
Isn't that cheaper than building a beast like boutique or specialized thing?
It doesn't have
Well, the Starship won't do any good at Enceladus. There's got to be something aboard it that's going to make the measurements that we want to make. But yeah, okay, this is niche. This is a niche thing. Look, I hope you're right. I don't mean to be a wet blanket. I don't mean to be like a downer. I would love to be. I'd love to be wrong.
We have a question for you, right? JWST currently costs 11 billion. If launch costs were zero or very cheap, how much would that JWST cost?
It would be a completely different design. You wouldn't do it that way.
How would you do it?
You'd assemble it in space. You'd build it robust enough that it can handle acceleration loads. And you'd check it out in LEO before you send it.
What are we sending where?
Web. Not web.
Web.
Something that does what web does.
Yeah.
It would be a complete.
I don't even think the web could be unfolded inside of the Starship, though.
No,
it's big.
You wouldn't unfold. You wouldn't do origami. You would assemble it in space.
Yeah, I can tell you.
When I think of how much space assembly technology we could have developed for what we spent on web, I just read.
Or
$11 billion. What could we have done with that in terms of developing our capability to build large things in space?
So I have another question for you. You said that a long time ago a lot of this research was privately funded, the telescopes, etc. Back then, did anyone complain about the billionaires' egos and why they felt the need to build these useless things just to promote themselves and
their legacies?
And their legacies.
Yeah, you'd have to ask Alex.
Yeah. That's a really good question.
I mean,
it'd be great.
I really want to know.
Should I call Alex and ask him right now?
Yeah.
I mean, like Yerkes. Yerkes was founded by a Chicago businessman who basically monopolized.
Call Alex McDonald.
Basically monopolized the public transit system, and he's become sort of a villain. So he tried to resurrect his reputation by giving the University of Chicago money to build this observatory up in Wisconsin.
I have a question. Can we just take ourselves to the moon? So we seem to be within grasp of like hanging out on the moon and having a bunch of people hang out on the moon. Right? Is that in your Creon or others? Is that a worthwhile thing? Are we going to bother doing that?
What? Go back to the moon?
Go back to the moon and have a bunch of people hang out on the moon. I don't know, mine the moon, do stuff on the moon.
I think there's a group of people, and I'm associated with them. It's called Open Lunar. They're not the only group. There's a Moon versus Mars pseudo debate going on, like which one should we go for? And Elon Musk is the leader of Mars first, and Will Marshall and his people are the leader of Moon first, at least in my circle. And they like to argue, but I don't think there's any reason that you can't do both. I mean, the Starship can go to the moon easier than it can go to Mars. A lot easier. Landing on the moon is one of the easiest places in the solar system, actually. And landing on Mars is arguably the hardest. It's the hardest one that you can land on that you can escape from. You actually, there's some places, like if Jupiter were solid, like you could never leave because a chemical rocket just can't do it. A chemical rocket can barely leave Earth. This is one of the reasons you have giant rockets with tiny little payloads, is because chemical energy is barely enough to get anything off the Earth. And if the Earth were like twice as big or twice as massive, chemical rockets just would not work. So
space infrastructure should space infrastructure should be in space. We should
space or on the moon.
Well, the Joys have to get something up from the Earth. They will for a while. But yeah, I mean, there's that whole thing. But people hanging out on the moon. I don't know about hanging out. An interesting question that Open Lunar and other people have been working on, which is a very interesting science and engineering exercise, whether or not it's actually done in our lifetimes or not, is what does it take to support people on the moon? And how much does it take us to send from Earth to keep them alive? And like, what do those two curves look like? And then can we even envision something that is self-sustaining on the moon? Physically self-sustaining? Maybe not. What about economically self-sustaining? What about if you have to pay for all the necessary imports from Earth, but you're producing something of value so that the finances close? This is, to me, is a very interesting question. Is there something that can be done on the moon, like mining propellant and sending it somewhere that pays off? It's a hard problem. Nobody really knows, but there's very few who've seriously looked at what it would take because if you don't have closure, either economic or physical, and physical is super hard because there's elements that just aren't on the moon that we probably need to have a functioning ecosystem. And oh, by the way, the moon has a 28-day day. Like the sun rises and sets every 28 days on the moon, not every 24 hours. So nothing will grow on the moon unless it's under artificial light. And so there's a lot.
That technology has advanced recently.
What?
That technology has advanced recently.
Fair enough.
I heard, was it Rusty Schweikert make a pitch for terraforming?
One thing I've said about that, one thing about terraforming is that all these people are like, so let's terraform Mars, and it's like, we're kind of terraforming the Earth right now, and we should probably get that under control first.
His pitch was basically that it would be a lot easier and a lot cheaper than Mars, and that it would work just
terraforming
as well.
What?
Moon. What? Yeah, that was sort of my reaction. And he kind of laid it out. It was like, yeah, that actually makes sense.
Well, that's questionable. I mean, Mars has these polar caps with CO2, and that can do a lot because you can make it has water and it's CO2, you can make a greenhouse effect. The moon has some water and some CO2 frozen in the polar regions, but it's like much drier than the driest desert on Earth.
I don't think he was planning on getting materials from the moon.
No, you'd have to bring in comets.
Yeah, well, if we're going to bombard the moon, what could possibly go wrong? Bringing in comets to bombard the moon. All right, you guys, look, it is now 4 o'clock, and I'm cold. Feel free to continue.
Thank you, Creon.
Thank you so much for coming. Oh.